The auctioneer's voice cut through the heat like a dull blade. Opening bid, $50. A man in the back of the crowd laughed, a short, wet sound that died quick. $50 for 400 acres of good grazing ground. Clara Whitfield stood with her back to the fence, her hands limp at her sides, her face empty. 3 men in dusty coats raised their hands one after another. Cole Whitmore's mustache twitched. Wade Briggs spit tobacco. Buck Larson didn't even look at the land. He just looked at her. The other 2 bidders understood the arithmetic. They kept their hands at their sides and stared at the dirt. From the shade of the mercantile porch, a stranger in a red bandana rolled a cigarette. He didn't move fast. His fingers worked the paper slow, like a man with no place to be. His gray vest was buttoned straight. His dark brown horse was tied to the rail beside him. He watched the auction like a man reading weather. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He glanced at the sheet of paper in his hand, the forged debt, though nobody said that out loud, and shifted his weight. $50. Do I hear 55? Nobody spoke. A fly landed on Clara's cheek. She didn't brush it off. Whitmore lifted his hand again, lazy. 55. Briggs followed. 60. Larson's hand barely came off his belt. 65. Roy Taggart, a cattleman who'd known Clara's husband, opened his mouth. He was one of the 2 honest bidders. His right hand twitched at his side. Then his wife touched his elbow and he closed his mouth. His hand stayed down. The other man, a skinny farmer named Seth, had already turned his back to the whole thing. The auctioneer waited the full count. He was a thin man with a clerk's face, hired for the day. He didn't look at Clara. He didn't look at anyone. 65 going once, twice. He paused. The paper shook in his hand. Buck Larson turned his head just enough to stare at him. The auctioneer swallowed. Sold. To Mr. Larson for $65. Clara let out a breath. It wasn't a sigh. It wasn't a cry. It was just air leaving a body. The stranger finished his cigarette. He tucked it into the corner of his mouth, unlit, and pushed off the post. His spurs didn't make a sound on the dry wood. He walked toward his horse the way a man walks when he's made a decision. Subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from? The auctioneer folded his papers like a man closing a coffin and hurried off the platform without a word. The crowd began to scatter, boots scraping dry dirt. Nobody looked at Clara Whitfield. Nobody paused to speak. Roy Taggart walked away with his wife's hand tight on his arm, his head down. Seth was already gone. Buck Larson didn't move fast. He tucked the auction receipt into his coat pocket, slow and deliberate. Then he walked over to Clara the way a man walks to a hitching post. Briggs and Whitmore followed like trained dogs. Clara hadn't moved from the fence. Her hands were shaking now, just a little, the way a leaf trembles before a storm. Larson stopped 2 feet from her boot tips and grinned. It was a thin grin. Practiced. Mrs. Whitfield, pleasant day for a sale. She didn't answer. He pulled the paper back out, unfolded it, and held it between them. The ink was still fresh. $65. Paid in full. Your land's ours now. Official. Clara's jaw tightened. She could see the signatures on the bottom of the page. Her husband's name, or what they'd written to look like it. The loop on the J was wrong. John Whitfield had closed his J's hard, like a scratch. This one was soft, rounded. She'd seen her husband sign 1,000 times. That wasn't his hand. You think I can't read my own husband's mark? Her voice was dry and cracked. That stroke's wrong. A child could see it. Larson didn't blink. He folded the paper again and slid it back into his coat. The judge didn't see it wrong. The bank didn't see it wrong. You're a widow with no money and no lawyer. You want to fight this in court, Mrs. Whitfield? Court costs money, time, lawyers. He tilted his head. You got any of that? Briggs spit tobacco into the dust. Whitmore smiled and smoothed his mustache. Clara's throat moved, but no words came. Larson stepped closer. 3 days. I'm being generous. Pack your things. Take your pots, your hens, whatever you can carry. After that, this land belongs to the railroad. Railroad, Clara whispered. They don't need more dirt. They need souls crushed under it. Larson's grin thinned into a hard line. 3 days. He turned and walked to his horse. Briggs and Whitmore followed, mounting up without a glance back. Their horses kicked up dust that settled on Clara's dress. She stood there for a long moment. The sun hammered down. The empty yard smelled of trampled sage and horse sweat. Then she heard the slow, steady thud of hooves, not from the direction the men had gone, but from the Mercantile road. The stranger rode up on his dark brown horse. He didn't hurry. He didn't call out. His red bandana moved slightly in the hot breeze. He stopped his horse at the broken gate and looked down at Clara with an expression that wasn't pity. It was just waiting. He swung a leg over and dismounted. The spurs chimed softly against the dirt. He pulled the cigarette from his mouth, unlit, and tucked it away. They left you breathing, he said. It wasn't a question. Clara blinked. For now. You got anybody to help you? She looked at the fence, the barn, the empty road. Nobody that's coming. The stranger nodded. He didn't promise anything. He just said, I could use some water, from the well, if you don't mind. She stared at him, trying to read his face. It was like reading a closed door. But she turned and walked toward the well anyway. The pump handle was warm to the touch. She worked it twice before the water came, a clear stream that splashed into the tin dipper. The stranger walked over, took the dipper, and drank slow. His eyes moved across the property, the broken fence post, the hoofprints in the yard, the auction platform still standing by the barn. He handed the dipper back. You believe that paper's false? I know it's false. But you ain't got the proof. Clara's lips pressed tight. I've got the real receipts. I've got a letter. I was too scared to use them. I thought if I just stayed quiet, they'd leave me alone. The stranger reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a fresh paper and tobacco. He began rolling another cigarette, his fingers moving without thought. Quiet didn't work. No, she said. It didn't. He struck a match on the pump, lit the cigarette this time, and took a long pull. Smoke wreathed his face. You got those papers somewhere safe? Buried. Good. He nodded toward the road. I'll be back before the 3 days are up. If you're still here? He didn't wait for thanks. He mounted his horse, turned east, and rode away into the heat shimmer, trailing a thin line of smoke behind him. Clara watched until he was nothing but a shape against the dry hills. She put the dipper back on the hook, straightened her dress, and walked toward the barn to check on the one thing she still owned. Her resolve. The stranger rode into town an hour before sundown, his dark horse walking easy down the dusty main street. He didn't stop at the saloon first. He pulled up in front of a small clapboard building with a hand-painted sign that said, Notary Public, Elias Finch. A thin man with ink-stained fingers looked up when the door opened. The light came in low and orange behind the stranger. The red bandana was still there at his throat. You're Finch. I am. The stranger walked to the desk without an invitation. He didn't sit. You witnessed a signature a few weeks back, a debt note. John Whitfield. The notary's pen stopped moving. He set it down carefully. Yes, I notarized a document. You saw him sign it? Silence. The notary's throat worked. I was told it was him. Mr. Larson brought it in. He said Whitfield was outside and couldn't come in. He got sick. So you didn't see his face? No. Did you ask? The notary looked at his fingers. Mr. Larson was insistent. The stranger didn't blink. You signed blind. That's what you're telling me. I didn't know it would come to this. You chose not to know. He turned his back on the man and walked out. The door swung shut, soft, behind him. The bank was closed, but the clerk was still inside, stacking papers. The stranger knocked on the window until the man came to the door with a key in his hand and a frown on his face. What is it? We're shut. John Whitfield's account, the amended records. The clerk's frown tightened. I can't share private business. The judge ordered it, didn't he? An amended title. I just follow court orders. Did you check if the signature matched the original? The clerk's eyes darted to the street. I was told it was in order. Told by who? The judge's clerk. The stranger nodded, slow. You saw the name on the order. You saw the foreclosure date. You processed it and went home. The clerk said nothing. That's a choice, the stranger said, and walked away. He found Judge Augustus Pembroke at his house on the north end of town, sitting on the porch with a glass of brandy and the evening paper. A woman in a linen dress was inside, humming. The judge looked up as the stranger stepped onto the porch boards. I don't know you. No, sir. You don't. The stranger stood with his boots planted. You approved a foreclosure on a widow's property, based on a debt note signed by a dead man. The judge's face went still. That's a serious accusation. I've got a notary who never saw the signer, a bank clerk who followed your order without checking, and a signature that a child could spot as false. You looked at that document, Your Honor. You saw it. I saw a valid legal instrument. You saw what you wanted to see. The judge stood up. His brandy sloshed. Who the devil are you to come to my home and— Someone who pays attention, the stranger said. I'll be back with the real papers, the ones your friends burned. Only I found them first. He stepped off the porch. The judge shouted after him, but the stranger didn't turn. He walked his horse down the darkening street toward the telegraph office, where a single lamp burned. He had one more thing to confirm. The number he'd seen on that intercepted wire weeks ago, the number Larson thought was secret. $500. The exact bribe price. He already knew. He just wanted to see the look on the clerk's face when he asked to see the old records. He stopped outside the telegraph office, leaned against the hitching post, and rolled a fresh cigarette. Unlit, just holding it between his fingers, waiting. The stranger pushed off the hitching post and walked through the settling dark toward the main square. A light had come on inside the telegraph office, but he didn't go in. He already had what he needed. He'd seen the clerk's face and known the answer before the question was finished. The $500 number rattled around in his head like a bullet in a tin can. He crossed the street to where a crowd was beginning to form again. It wasn't the auction anymore. That part was done. But the formal transfer was happening right now under the big oak tree where the town held its public business. A portable desk had been set up. The auctioneer stood behind it with a fresh sheet of paper and a bottle of ink. Buck Larson stood next to him, arms crossed, coat still dusty from the ride. Wade Briggs and Cole Whitmore flanked him. The notary, Elias Finch, sat off to one side with his ink-stained fingers pressed flat on his knees. Sheriff Tom Weston stood near the edge of the crowd, arms folded, badge catching the lantern light. His eyes looked tired. They'd looked tired for years. Doc Elmer, the town physician, stood off to the side with his hat in his hands. Roy Taggart was there too, at the back of the crowd with his wife, who kept her hand tight on his arm. Neither of them looked up. Seth had stayed home. So had a dozen others who'd known John Whitfield and couldn't bear to watch. A few men in town had come out of curiosity. Others came because they were told to. A land transfer was official business, and official business meant witnesses. None of them looked pleased. They stood with their shoulders high and their mouths closed, the way people do when they're afraid of being noticed. The auctioneer uncorked the ink bottle. He dipped his pen and touched it to the paper. This document hereby transfers all rights and titles to the property known as the Whitfield Homestead. Hold that. The voice cut through the warm evening air like a knife through cloth. It wasn't loud. It was steady. The stranger stepped out from the crowd, moving past Roy Taggart without a glance, his boots making soft sounds on the packed dirt. His red bandana was snug at his throat. The unlit cigarette still rested between his fingers. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. He reached the portable desk and placed his hand on the auctioneer's arm, gentle but firm. The pen stopped. Ink dripped from the nib onto the paper, a small black stain. Larson's face went hard. "Who the devil are you?" The stranger didn't answer him. He pulled a folded paper from inside his vest. Not the real receipts, not yet, but something just as useful. It was the telegraph ledger slip he'd taken from the station clerk 10 minutes ago, the one that recorded the wire from the railroad office to the local bank. The numbers were right there, plain as day. The amount, the authorization code, the name of the man who'd sent it. He held it up so the crowd could see. 5 minutes, he said. He looked at the auctioneer, not Larson. "I'm asking for 5 minutes. Before you put your name on that paper, you should know what you're signing over." The auctioneer's throat moved. "I'm just following the court order." "Then 5 minutes won't hurt you, will it?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement that ended with a period. Buck Larson stepped forward. His thick neck was red. "This ain't your business, friend. The court ruled. The land sold." $65, the stranger said, still looking at the auctioneer. "For 400 acres, a figure you wrote down. Now what if I told you that wasn't the real number? What if I told you the real number was 500? A murmur moved through the crowd. Roy Taggart lifted his head. His wife's hand tightened on his arm, but she didn't pull him away this time. Larson's jaw clamped shut. Briggs spit tobacco into the dirt, but he didn't say a word. Whitmore's oily mustache twitched. He knew that number. He knew exactly what it meant. The stranger held the paper higher, so the lantern light caught the ink. "There's a wire on record, $500, paid from the railroad to a certain account. You can guess whose. Now I'm just a man with 5 minutes to spare. But if I'm right, this auction wasn't a sale, it was a payoff." Sheriff Weston pushed off the tree he'd been leaning against. He didn't draw his weapon. He just straightened up and looked at the paper in the stranger's hand. 5 minutes. The crowd was holding its breath. The auctioneer's pen was still in his fingers, dripping ink onto the deed. The stranger lowered the telegraph slip and let it rest on the desk next to the auctioneer's ink-stained fingers. The crowd didn't move. The auctioneer stared at the slip, then at Buck Larson, then back at the paper. His lips parted, but no sound came. 5 minutes, the stranger said again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Everyone on that patch of dirt was already straining to hear him. He slid his hand inside his vest, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a second document, a thicker sheet, yellowed at the edges, folded twice like it had been carried a long time in a tight pocket. It was the original loan record, not the amended copy that had been presented in court, not the version with the soft loop on the J. This was the real paper, signed by John Whitfield in a hard, scratchy hand 5 years ago, paid in full, stamped by the bank, archived and forgotten, but not destroyed. The stranger laid it beside the telegraph slip. This is the bank's original record, from before the judge's order, before the amendment. It shows the loan was closed, zero balance. The debt paper you're about to sign over is based on a forgery. The auctioneer's hand trembled. He pulled the document closer and angled it toward the lantern light. His eyes tracked the dates, the amounts, the signature. Then he looked at the amended copy that still lay on his desk, the one Buck Larson had handed him that morning. The two signatures didn't match. Not even close. Cole Whitmore stepped forward, mustache twitching. "Where did you get that? The bank sealed those records." "Did they?" the stranger said. He didn't look at Whitmore. He kept his eyes on the auctioneer. "You're a notary. You know what a false instrument looks like. You're holding two papers. One is real, one isn't. Tell these people which is which." The auctioneer swallowed hard. He lifted the original loan record. "This one. The signatures match the other documents I've seen from Mr. Whitfield. The other one..." He trailed off. Buck Larson's hand drifted toward his belt. His thick neck was crimson now. Wade Briggs stopped spitting tobacco. The crowd shifted, uneasy but no longer silent. A few men in the back began to murmur. Roy Taggart's wife let go of his arm. The stranger took his unlit cigarette from his mouth and tucked it behind his ear. He hadn't lit it yet. He was saving it. "You've been swindled," he said to the crowd, but he spoke just loud enough for the auctioneer to hear. "The railroad paid $500 to clear this land, not $65. That wire says so. This paper says the debt was fake. You can finish your transfer if you want, but you'll be signing your name to a crime." The auctioneer put down his pen. He looked at Whitmore, then at Larson. "I can't notarize this. Not with these documents here. It would be fraud." Larson's voice was low and ugly. "You'll do what the court ordered." "The court didn't see this record," the auctioneer said. His voice was shaking, but he didn't look away. "I won't be party to it." The tension in the air was like dry tinder. A lantern flickered. The sheriff shifted his weight but didn't intervene. The stranger didn't move. He stood there with his hands relaxed, his vest unbuttoned just enough to show the handle of his pistol. The rifle was still on his horse. He didn't need it. Larson's eyes burned into the stranger. "You've made a mistake." "I've made a few," the stranger said. "This isn't one of them." He picked up the original loan record and folded it carefully. He slid it back into his vest. The telegraph slip he left on the desk for the crowd to see. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, past Roy Taggart and Doc Elmer and the dozen others who had come to witness a theft. Nobody stopped him. Behind him, the auctioneer began packing his things. Larson and Whitmore stood frozen by the desk, the weight of exposure settling on them like a storm cloud. Wade Briggs watched the stranger's back with murder in his eyes. The stranger didn't look back. He didn't hurry. He just walked through the crowd, hand-rolled cigarette still tucked behind his ear, and disappeared into the dark toward the livery stable. He had given Clara Whitfield more than a delay. He had given the whole town the truth. And now the reckoning would come fast. The stranger had only made it 20 paces when a new voice cut through the murmuring crowd. It was smooth, educated, the kind of voice that belonged in a city courtroom, not a dirt street town. "That document isn't worth the paper it's printed on." The stranger stopped. He didn't turn around yet. He just stood there, one hand loose at his side, the other still holding the unlit cigarette he'd tucked behind his ear earlier. His boots pressed into the dry earth. The crowd behind him shifted, parting to let the speaker through. A man stepped forward from the direction of the hotel. He wore a clean gray suit with a satin waistcoat, a gold watch chain hanging at his belly. His shoes had no dust on them. He wasn't from here. He had a leather satchel tucked under one arm, and the kind of smile that never came from joy. "I'm Mr. Albright," he said, addressing the crowd, but looking at the auctioneer's desk where the documents still lay. "Legal counsel for the railroad's land acquisition office, and I assure you whatever paper that cowboy produced is either a counterfeit or a forgery of his own making." Buck Larson straightened. Some color came back into his thick neck. Wade Briggs stopped spitting. The crowd, which had started to believe the stranger, now hung in the air again, uncertain. Albright pulled a document from his satchel. He held it up. "This is the court-certified copy of the amended loan, signed and notarized by a sworn officer of the law. The original was altered per a lawful order from Judge Pembroke. If someone found an old, voided copy in the bank archives, that doesn't change the court's ruling." He looked at the stranger's back. "You can wave any paper you want, cowboy. The law is the law. And the law says this land belongs to the railroad." The stranger didn't move for a long moment. Then he reached up, took the cigarette from behind his ear, and placed it between his lips. He still didn't light it. He turned around, slow and easy. He walked back toward the desk. The crowd made room. He stopped 3 feet from Albright and let the man's words hang in the air. Then he looked past him, scanning the faces in the crowd. "You said the original was altered by a lawful order," the stranger said. His voice was calm. "You're right. It was altered. But not by Judge Pembroke. He only signed what was put in front of him. The man who actually altered the bank record is standing right here." The crowd went still. Several men glanced at their neighbors. The stranger pointed. Not at the lawyer. Not at Larson. He pointed toward a thin man with ink-stained fingers who was trying to ease his way toward the back of the gathering. The same bank clerk who had avoided his eyes earlier that day. "Him," the stranger said. The clerk froze. His face went pale, even in the yellow lantern light. "That man altered the original ledger on the 8th of last month. He changed John Whitfield's paid-in full notation to a $500 debt. He did it late at night, after the bank was closed. And for that alteration, a deposit was made into his personal account the next morning. $50. The clerk's mouth opened, but no words came out. His ink-stained hands started trembling. Albright's smooth expression flickered. He glanced at the clerk, then back at the stranger. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," the stranger said. "It's a statement. The wire transfer proves the railroad paid $500. The altered ledger shows a $500 debt. The clerk's own deposit records show $50. You can check the bank's books right now. They're still open for another hour." The clerk bolted. He shoved past 2 men and ran for the dark street. But Sheriff Tom Weston, for the first time all evening, stepped forward and caught him by the arm. The clerk thrashed, but the sheriff held on. The crowd erupted. Roy Taggart shouted. Doc Elmer's eyes were wide. Even Seth, who'd stayed away earlier, had come back and stood at the edge of the light. Albright's lawyer's smile was gone. He looked at Larson, but Larson was staring at the ground. The document in Albright's hand suddenly looked very heavy. The stranger stepped closer to Albright. "You worked real hard on that speech," he said. "But I've got a bigger speech coming, and it's going to name everyone, including you." He turned and walked toward the bank. He didn't hurry. He didn't have to. The whole town was already following. The bank's front porch was narrow and warped, but it held the weight of half the town now. Men crowded the steps, their boots scraping wood, their breath making small clouds in the cooling night air. The clerk with the ink-stained hands was still squirming in Sheriff Tom Weston's grip, his face as pale as the ledger pages he'd doctored. Buck Larson stood 10 feet away, with Wade Briggs and Cole Whitmore, their coats still dusty from the ride that morning. The lawyer Albright was close behind them, his satchel clutched to his chest like a shield. The stranger stopped at the bottom step and turned to face the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his arms. He just looked at the clerk and waited. The clerk stopped squirming. His eyes found the stranger's and something broke inside him. Not loudly, just a small, quiet collapse. He let out a sound that was half sob, half surrender. "I did it," he said. The words spilled out fast, like he'd been holding them underwater for a month. "I changed the entry, $50. They gave me $50 to alter the book. I didn't know what else to do." The crowd made a noise. Not a cheer, not a gasp, but a deep, rumbling exhale, like a beast that had just been unshackled. Roy Taggart stepped forward from the edge of the porch. Doc Elmer pulled his hat tighter. Seth, the skinny farmer who'd stayed away from the auction, pushed through to the front. Albright tried to speak. "This man is clearly—" "Quiet," Sheriff Weston said. His voice cracked, but his hand on the clerk's arm was steady. He stared at Albright with eyes that had been tired for years, but were now just wide awake. The auctioneer, who had followed the crowd from his portable desk, raised his hand for attention. The ink from his pen had dried dark on his fingers. "I'm suspending the auction," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Pending a full review, no transfer will be registered." Larson's thick neck went from red to purple. He turned and spat into the dirt. "You can't do that." "I just did," the auctioneer said. His voice didn't shake this time. Whitmore's mustache twitched. His hand moved toward his belt. Briggs, the one who was always spitting, let his fingers curl around the handle of his revolver. But they didn't draw. Not yet. They were watching the crowd, doing the math. The stranger still hadn't moved. His unlit cigarette hung from his lips, untouched. He seemed to be waiting for something specific. He didn't have to wait long. Roy Taggart stepped out of the crowd, his wife's hand no longer on his arm. He was holding a heavy ranch rifle, the stock worn smooth from years of use. He stood beside the stranger and faced Larson without a word. Then Seth joined him. The skinny farmer had a double-barreled shotgun that looked older than the town itself, but it was pointed at the ground, ready. His hands were trembling, but he didn't lower it. Doc Elmer had no gun. He just walked to the other side of the stranger and crossed his arms. The gesture said everything a weapon could. The math changed in an instant. 3 men, plus the sheriff who had finally let go of the clerk and was now resting his hand on his own holster. The stranger was no longer alone. Larson looked at the faces in front of him. Briggs and Whitmore looked at each other. Albright's satchel dropped to the dirt. The stranger reached up, finally, and pulled the match from behind his ear. He struck it on the sole of his boot and lit the cigarette. The tiny flame burned bright in the dark. Then he blew out a thin stream of smoke and said nothing. The silence was the only answer they needed. The smoke from the stranger's cigarette curled upward and vanished into the dark. For a long moment, nobody on that porch moved. The entire town hung in the balance. A dozen men watching Buck Larson's thick neck turn purple, watching Wade Briggs spit one last time into the dirt, watching Cole Whitmore's oily mustache twitch like a dying insect. Larson broke first. He let out a sound that wasn't a word, just a wet, furious grunt. His hand dropped to his belt. He wasn't reaching for a paper. He was reaching for the revolver tucked against his hip. The stranger's cigarette didn't even fall from his lips. His rifle came up in one fluid motion, the wooden stock already pressed against his shoulder before Larson's fingers touched metal. The muzzle pointed at Larson's chest, steady as a fence post. "Don't," the stranger said. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was a single syllable that carried more weight than every legal document in that satchel. Larson's hand stopped. His face, which had been purple with rage, drained to a sick gray. Wade Briggs didn't learn the lesson. He was always the one spitting, always the one who burned the barn. He saw Larson freeze and thought he could be faster. His hand snatched at his own gun, the barrel already clearing leather. The stranger's rifle cracked. The sound split the night like a lightning strike. Briggs screamed and dropped the weapon, clutching his forearm where the bullet had sliced a clean line through flesh and sleeve. He stumbled backward into Whitmore, and both of them hit the dirt outside the bank. Larson stood alone, his hands now raised slowly, his eyes wide with the understanding that he was no longer the predator. Sheriff Tom Weston moved at last. He stepped off the porch, his badge catching the lantern light, and he pulled the revolver from his own holster with hands that didn't shake anymore. "Buck Larson," he said, his voice louder than it had been all year. "You're under arrest for forgery, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Wade Briggs, Cole Whitmore, the same goes for you." The crowd surged forward. Roy Taggart kept his rifle trained on the two men on the ground. Seth, the skinny farmer, stood so still he might have been a fence rail, but his shotgun never wavered. Doc Elmer knelt by Briggs, pulling a bandana from his pocket to press against the wound. The lawyer Albright had already started backing toward the hotel, his satchel abandoned in the dirt. He didn't make it 5 steps before 2 townsmen blocked his path. "Where do you think you're going?" Roy Taggart asked. Albright's smooth city face crumpled. He said nothing. Clara Whitfield appeared at the edge of the crowd. She had walked from her homestead when the shooting stopped, following the noise, following the trail of dust that led from her burned barn to the town square. She still held the smoked letter in her hand, the one the stranger had lit his cigarette with. Her eyes were dry now, but they weren't empty anymore. They burned with something that had been buried a long time. She walked past the crowd, past the sheriff, past the man with the red bandana who was calmly reloading his rifle. She stopped in front of Buck Larson, who couldn't meet her gaze. "The land stays mine," she said. "Not yours, not the railroad's. Mine." The auctioneer scrambled forward, his inky fingers trembling as he pulled the forged document from his coat. He tore it in half, then tore it again. The pieces scattered in the wind. By morning, the telegraph would be humming. The circuit judge would be summoned. The railroad's land office in Omaha would receive a strongly worded wire about a lawyer named Albright, who was no longer in their employ. Edmund Ashworth, the frightened surveyor, would sign a sworn affidavit. The bank clerk would confess everything a second time to a federal marshal. Judge Pembroke would quietly resign and move east. None of that needed to happen right now. The truth was already standing in the street, and it had already won. Clara turned to face the stranger. He was finished with his rifle. He slung it back into the saddle scabbard and swung onto his horse with the same quiet ease he'd used when he first rode onto her land. The gray vest was still buttoned straight. The red bandana still sat at his throat. The cigarette between his lips was nothing but a stub now, but he didn't toss it away. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was just the truth. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a single fresh cigarette. He handed it down to her. "You owe me one, ma'am," he said. "That one you lit with the letter doesn't count." She caught the cigarette. A laugh escaped her, not loud, but real. It was the first laugh to cross her lips, since the day they put her husband in the ground. She held it tight in her calloused hand. He tipped his hat, once, slow, and turned his horse east. The crowd parted. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the steady clop of hooves on the dry main street, and then the soft whisper of spurs that didn't make noise on wood. By the time the sun rose, he was already a memory. All they'd remember was a red bandana, a gray vest, and a quiet cowboy who rolled his cigarette slow. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.